Great. And you can still see my face, right?
Yes.
Wonderful, wonderful. All right, are we ready to go?
Yes, we are. It's all yours.
Okay. Good evening and welcome, everyone. It's later here in France. We're in different time zones, but I'm staying awake and doing okay. Tonight's conversation is about sacred geometry, but a very particular aspect thereof is understanding the connections between the physics and the science versus the psychology and the emotion and coherent emotion. And the way we're going to start the conversation, we're going to do it in three sections here. The first section is going to use the example of John Dee's work with designing the hypercube, the discovering of the ONEness, and apparently how he came to design the Shakespearean theater and what that meant in terms of understanding how a design could accomplish a fusion and oneness experience psychologically, in terms of the plasma science, the compression, and then we'll apply that to the physics of what that teaches about actual fusion physics and the mythology of alchemy, and the physics of alchemy, which everyone agrees is the central part of what Shakespeare was about. So the real physics of alchemy is indeed intimated in the geometry of fusion, which was the design of the Shakespearean theater. And the Dee and Kelly connection to that and their history to alchemy, we may have some fun telling stories tonight. The second part of this evening's conversation will then be hopefully a fairly concise summary of exactly how it is that phase conjugation produces negentropy, which is to say, what is the geometry of the origin of biologic negentropy in general, which is the title of my new book, Origins of Biologic Negentropy, at fractalfield.com. So we'll try to talk about that in terms of the geometry and the wave mechanics, and both an intuitive and a technical understanding. And then the third part of this evening's conversation will be an example of the application of the physics of implosive geometry, phase conjugation and fusion, to plasma science and healing science, specifically our Therify invention, Therify.net. We'll talk about how we've been successful in creating what is apparently a true time reversal and rejuvenation field in the Therify technology. Literally, we've taken this equation for the wavelengths of negentropy and applied it to the specific frequency signature of the plasma, as apparently the ancient Egyptians knew how to do, indicated by this picture. And we've shown that indeed a regeneration, rejuvenation, we've been very successful in pain relief and many other issues. Although we don't make medical claims, the reports are quite consistent that we're quite able to help people, which is with what is effectively simply the light of a plasma tube when the frequency signatures are accurately applied into this wave geometry of implosion. So we're going to talk about evidence or proof that this physics of negentropy, the origin of implosive self-organization, actually works commercially as well as scientifically. So that'll be a bit of a conclusion. Of course, hopefully, maybe there's some time for questions if the mechanism is here. So we begin. There is a famous mythology that Shakespeare was participating in the famous alchemy laboratory of John Dee and Kelly in Prague. Let's see, there's a web article about that. I'll bring it up here, goldenmean.info/science of alchemy. And so here's the picture. There's John Dee, and this is Vincent Bridges, who inspired a lot of this work and gave this talk, which we described here. And there's an article here I want to show you. This is the article, yes. So this, I believe, appeared originally in Atlantis Rising magazine about Shakespeare and Dr. Dee. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up here is because a fun story makes the science more interesting. And it's a very fun story that apparently And I believe refer specifically to the science of alchemy, the science of fusion, the science of human oneness experience, the science of implosion, and make that connection by using a fun story from history. And that's where we're going with the Dee and Kelly story. So many of you know that John Dee was mythologically thought of as probably the origin of the 007 myth. The story is that when Dee, who was Dee and Shakespeare were both obviously documented to be hired spies of Queen Elizabeth, who led some of the first black ops projects in the Catholics versus the Protestants issues leading up to the Spanish Armada, which is where this story is going. And when they would send a letter to Queen Elizabeth saying, "For your eyes only," there's a little sign that was a symbol of her eyeglasses, which looked like a 007. Now that's the mythology. Whether that part is true or not, I'm not sure. But there is extensive historical evidence which will become the subject of a dramatic new book and documentary series. One part of that book I am writing with Vincent Bridges' former co-author. Vincent has passed recently in Prague, sadly, and this conversation is in part in tribute to him. And his co-author, Teresa Burns, is working closely with me now, although she's in China at the moment. She just came back from Prague. And we're developing this where I would develop the physics and science story of alchemy and fusion from the Shakespeare Kelly Dee story, and she would develop the historical documentation. So we're playing with this manuscript, and Vincent left some pretty wonderful manuscripts when he died, and Teresa was already in the process of editing and working on them with him. So this was the article that originally appeared in Atlantis Rising about, apparently, every time Shakespeare disappeared from history for X number of months, he would show up in John Dee's famous notebook under the name Francis Garland, from the story of the Garland brothers, which was this Garland of Roses, which was a famous painting about alchemy, actually. And so Francis Garland was a code name for Tucliamius Shakespeare, supposedly, according to the documentation from Teresa and Vincent. And Garland learned, Shakespeare, under the pseudonym Garland, learned so many of the mysteries that later show up in the Shakespeare plays by being witness to the mysterious alchemic workings of Dee and Kelly in Prague. Now, Vincent apparently had many past life memories. One of them was of being Kelly, and those past life memories were very vivid. And in late life, Kelly was in prison and either refused or was unable to give the person keeping him in prison, who was King Rudolph, the secret of alchemy. And there was an argument about whether Kelly, in fact, knew the secret of alchemy. And I discussed this in depth with Vincent. And he said, well, originally he said, well, no, Kelly didn't want to tell the king because he thought he would misuse the knowledge. But if we read now the multiple manuscripts about, the real story of Kelly and Dee, which Vincent was writing, the deeper truth was that what is known as the Philosopher's Stone, or the projective powder, was in fact a red powder, which Kelly used to make that gold, and I will tell you more. The gold, which after Kelly and Dee produced it, they actually sent the chalice in which it was made to London, and the British Royal Society documented, you can look it up today, the purest gold they ever measured came from Kelly and Dee's alchemic workings in Prague. And this was of such historical significance that Queen Elizabeth had to dispatch her most clever spy, Shakespeare, who was under the name of Francis Garland. It's a story. It goes right down to the origin of the Prospero and the Tempest and how they cooked up the storm that apparently took out the Spanish Armada. This is the stuff of movies. It's pretty cool. And we're here to talk about the science lesson. So the science lesson, the alchemic science lesson, Remember, part of the conversation this evening is about the nature of charge implosion, non-destructive charge collapse, as plasma fusion, which is virtually identical with the physics of what's called non-destructive isotope transition, literally fusion. And we have science teams around the world involved in many aspects of this, been involved in this quite a long time. So we're going to use the story of the projective powder of the Philosopher's Stone to illuminate. So this is the story. A good part of this came through Vincent, which was that the original red powder that enabled Kelly to make the purest gold ever measured by the British Royal Society came from the Kaaba stone of the Muslims, now, which is also known as Lucifer's eye. Now, if you study the history and the physics, it appears that the Kaaba stone, first of all, there's whole films about the golden ratio in the history of the Kaaba stone, but more importantly, the Kaaba stone was apparently a meteor of the class of what's called glass meteors. And in a glass meteor, during the heat of re-entry, the only other metal that can withstand the heat without literally disappearing is generally the class of what's called PGM, platinum group metals, palladium, platinum, and gold. And when gold gets to a certain heat within the molten glass, the gold is vaporized and makes the glass red, hint, red powder. Now, one of the ways we know this is because it's well documented among those who have studied the alchemy of glassmaking in Prague that the way the Templars apparently made that famous deep red or deep purple glass of the famous Gothic stained glass windows of the Gothic cathedrals, which is so magical, that multiple layered patina, that the color of the deep purple red looks so dark you think it's black unless you're turning your head as you look at it, and then you realize it's a deep metaphor. I mean purple. And the way they made that glass was by bubbling vaporized gold through the glass at critical temperatures. Now, this is as far as Vincent went, which was very useful, but I've taken this a bit further and now realize that when the glass gets to a certain temperature, obviously it forms a foam. And if the foam is uniform enough, the macromolecular array geometry of the bubbles in the foam, think implosive phonon, sonoluminescence, implosive collapse in the sound, become self-similar or fractal to the molecular geometry. But more important, even more significant than that, is that when you vaporize the gold through the glass, you then produce an atomic geometry, which is potentially, again, self-similar right down to the atomic level. Now remember why the platinum group metals are called noble, is because the nobility of the noble gases and the nobility of the platinum group metals is both related to a fundamental physics phenomenon, which we have been teaching for years. And we have our famous little model here. This is the famous Star Mother kit, goldenmean.info/kit, which is essentially dodeca ecosa dodeca 3D infinite stellation, which I say is the only possible three-dimensional fractal. It is well known that the symmetry series of the electron shells, SPDF, S of course is a toroidal, which has two vortex. So the S suborbital of the electron of the atomic table is simply a donut, very simple, which is two vortex. And the pi suborbital, obviously cubic. If you take three pairs of donuts, you have the three faces, three pairs of faces of the cube, the six faces, which is six vortex, six electrons in the pi suborbital. But the D and F suborbitals, which are complete and noble in the noble gases and in the platinum group metals, The DNS suborbitals are specifically 10, 14 electrons, which is 5, 7 spin symmetry pairs. Now we're going to talk about 7 spins outside, 5 spins inside in terms of the anu, and now in terms of the fact that the tetracube, which is at the center, remember the cubic pi suborbital, the tetracube here has 7 arrows, 7 axes of spin symmetry, whereas the outer spin symmetry of Icosa is pent symmetry. So you have 5 spins outside, 7 spins inside, which is both the anu and the ophanum sigil of truth. And the braiding algorithm of DNA and the geometry of the human heart muscle, layers, 7 spins, and the geometry, clairvoyants have clearly identified the heart of the sun, and which has recently been documented to be also the geometry of the quark geometry of subatomic particles in Phillips' work, Psi Perception of Quarks. So there's a whole thing about 5 spins, 7 spins. So, getting back to our point, which was that the outer valence electron geometry of gold, particularly in the monoatomic or the noble gas state, is a precise dodecaecosa symmetry array, literally implosive, non-destructive collapse. Now, we have the whole discussion about that at fractalfield.com/cold plasma, where we discuss the fact that basically the fullerene geometry of monoatomics and noble gases and platinum group metals is all about implosive collapse due to basically the completion of the dodecaecosa symmetry of the array of the DS subshells. So, let's get back to the fun part of the story, which is that the capacitance of the glass of the Kaaba stone Lucifer's eye had a particular quality due to the self-similar fractality, which is that the macromolecular foam geometry, the bubbles in the foam of the glass, is now inhabited by the same self-similar implosive geometry in the gold monoatoms propagated through the glass, as in the Templar red glass and in the red eye of Lucifer, the Kaaba stone with golden ratio, and the famous red powder that Kelly could not get more of to make more gold when the King Rudolph put him in prison in the famous story. So, what is the physics? Well, first, a little bit more about the history. Vincent went so far as to document the period in history during which the famous Kaaba stone was in the control of who was called the Mad Caliph in Cairo, I believe. And the Mad Caliph he sold off literally approximately at least half the volume and mass of the Kaaba stone, which was ground up for various nefarious purposes, some of which, according to this myth, lands up in the hands of Kelly and Dee. Now, this sort of has to do with the famous Flamel and the Philosopher's Stone story. What is the Philosopher's Stone? The Philosopher's Stone is a stone whose capacitive radiance I call phase conjugate dielectric, which is to say implosive charge, radiates through the monoatomic outer layers into the liquid surrounding it. Now, Vincent said if you took some of that red powder and you placed it in a grain about the size of a grain of rice, and it was then dipped in wax, which when molten acted as a wetting agent, then it's dipped into the red hot mercury, which, as you know, is only one. Mercury has the identical nuclear geometry weight virtually as gold and needs the rearrangement of only one electron, essentially. Now, there are other issues, which is you need to place that chalice, as it were, of molten mercury into an electric geometry, which is fractal, which is to say an array geometry. We'll explain more as conjugate magnetic lines that cross and make centripetal. And also there's a critical phonon geometry, which is a frequency signature to trigger the isotope transition. And that's part of the equation set, which we have developed around this fusion physics. Now, not to digress, but let me just give you a little background on the fusion physics here, with the help of the Conjugate One group in Brazil, who also funded some of the 0-point research, conjugate1.com, we asked the scientist who is God, and she said, the Conjugate One. And so then we named the business conjugate1.com. and so they financed some of this work. Now, part of this work had to do with evaluating Rossi's work on cold fusion, the famous work by Rossi from Italy, which is now financed by industrial heat. And our lead scientist at the time, Bill Donovan, now Elizabeth, was funded to evaluate or study Rossi's work with Rossi in his lab in Miami, in Bologna, and later at their conference in Switzerland. And Bill, very sophisticated in this physics, and we should honor his work here, did an analysis and concluded that Rossi had misidentified the isotope transition sequences, that there's a table for the isotope transition sequences. And we have a private website about the isotope transition physics, and I'm only introducing that here, but I'm giving you a little bit of history. And that little bit of history includes this fun little tidbit that there is a scientist named Joe Champion who at one point claimed he had been able to calculate the critical temperature to critically catalyze many of the isotope transitions that could be then commercially useful, the real physics of alchemy, the real physics of plasma fusion. Now, Bill took that much further in this series of equations, and this is a spreadsheet series, every cell of which is equation-based, which is hundreds of pages long, and clearly identified both the frequency and the temperature. Remember, the temperature had been identified before, supposedly, but the frequency. Now, to catalyze isotope transitions, the real music. You remember then that famous movie, Chain Reaction, when the hero in the movie is playing his favorite music on his recorder, and suddenly this charge bubble chain reaction takes off, and he realizes, yes, there's a musical triggering. So obviously there's a frequency signature to this. There's a sound. And by equation, you can know what's happening. You basically have an electron shell that's here. So there's a certain amount of charge inertia in, let's say, the outer orbital. If the outer orbital is df, that's e cosa dodeca. So the electrons in the outer orbital are rotating. Now, if those electrons are to do non-destructive collapse, they need a path. Now, I started teaching that this was the physics of conductivity many years ago, and then Nassim later then agreed with me that if you take that path, which is the 7 spin symmetries of the stellated tetra, which is cube octa, and you produce that path from cube octa to E cosa, called the jitterbug, which I was fortunate to learn from Buckminster Fuller personally, the path of that jitterbug, now of course it starts as a stellated tetra, which is cube octa, but then it moves to E cosa, and then it moves to octa. And so but the part of that path of that jitterbug from cube octa to E cosa is actually a golden spiral path, which means that it's the path of non-destructive or constructive charge collapse, which both I and now later Nassim are both teaching is the true physics of the origin of superconductivity. Why? Because it creates zero resistance in the charge path through center, which is elimination of spin resistance, and therefore superconductive in the sense of zero resistance to passage of charge. So implosive charge collapse, physics, phase conjugation, and the jitterbug are all related into the physics of superconductivity and alchemy in the sense of the possible transition path between electron orbitals. So back to our story of Dee and Kelly. So Kelly and Dee had produced this gold with the red powder that Kelly couldn't make more of. The story was that actually one of the reasons they went to Prague was because the Moldavite on the streets of Prague had some of these phase conjugate dielectric properties. And if you want to know what a phase conjugate dielectric is, implosive capacitance, I suggest you read the paper famous Alice in Barium Titanate Land, where they see that these charge bubbles seem to self-organize as they propagate from place to place. It's like they know where each other are at a distance. In fact, phase conjugate dielectric fields are a good introduction to the spiritual science of plasma and how entities communicate, which is about these longitudinal waves, faster than light, how they communicate at a distance, which is how the collective unconscious works. And in fact, it is an introduction to the physics of telepathy because, for example, when the Russian Cozy Rev Mirror group placed these metal cylinders at exact magnetic line, Earth energy line crosses, the famous Cozy Rev mirrors, they produced telepathy so dependable it was of military grade. Well-documented literature. And the first thing they had to do when they placed these Cozy Rev mirror massive metal cylinders, we played with one in Belgium there, was they had to measure the nanoteslas of the magnetic line crosses. Why? Because you need a conjugate collapse, implosive cross point of charged lines to produce the centripetal force, which is conjugating charged lines, to produce a longitudinal EMF component, faster than light, which then interferes at a distance, literally non-locally. And that produces the physics of telepathy and non-locality and superluminal connections and all this thing about how the flame in the mind moves. And maybe we should look at a bit of a picture of that just to talk about the background. So the central motif of how we're going to introduce this in Shakespearean theater is right here. Remember, the 7 arrows of the tetra, which we will later see, and many of you see in my animations, creates the origin of the Hebrew alphabet, the layers of the heart muscle, and the anu, and the braid geometry of the DNA, thread, string, rope, etc. So you have this 7 arrows motif. And if you do these 7 spins with the dantian and with the double dorji, you have the 7arrows.net. And now we have octayoga.com. Very powerful way to inhabit your space shamanically is to actually do the yoga of the 7 spins, to inhabit the cube of space. So this is all about the cube of space, which we're going to see later is what the Tree of Life is about as well. And what the Ophanim Enochian ritual is about. It's about inhabiting the cube of space. What does that mean? Well, let's start here with the picture right here of, this is called 4-wave mixing in phase conjugate optics. Now, remember, the first place that self-organization, negentropy, is proven in the physics literature is in the arena of what's called phase conjugate optics. So what is that? Well, phase conjugate optics is when you get lasers to converge and meet, as it were, pine cones kissing noses, exactly opposing laser pairs. And this is called 4-wave mixing, and here's a picture. Now, when you get the lasers to meet so accurately like this, within a matrix called a phase conjugate mirror, whose molecular material is the magic of time reversal and negentropy in phase conjugate optics, it turns out that it's the super high dielectric, like barium strontium titanate, which enables this to work. Now, super high dielectrics, examples might be the dilithium crystals that Scotty used in Star Trek, in Star Wars, Star Trek. The dilithium crystal or certain crystals, barium strontium titanate, are called phase conjugate dielectric. Well, what does that mean? Well, the dielectric material in a capacitor is the insulator between the 2 conductive plates. Now, in a capacitor, you put an insulator between 2 conductive plates and then you ring it like a bell. And the way you bang on it to make it ring is with voltage, which Tesla called tension or simply pressure. a geometry of pressure, quite literally. We'll think about that when we get to the geometry of touch here in a moment. So if the dielectric constant is high enough, which is to say the quality of the dielectric material between the plates of capacitor, and this will introduce why you need organic material in your house, then if you hit the capacitor with the hammer of voltage, it will ring with like a bell with more energy than the energy with which you hit it. Now, this is shades of the film Meetings with Remarkable Men about testing who is the real Sufi master, is the one who knows how to make a perfect echo. I recommend that as your bumper sticker because a perfect echo is essentially a bell that can ring forever. Now, everybody wants a bell that can ring forever. The battery that rings forever, the bell that rings forever, the echo that rings forever, the wave that rings forever. I mean, literally, if you want to die successfully, what do you need to do? Set yourself up in a bell that rings forever. Ask any Hopi approaching a burial ground. He can tell you. She can tell you. So, getting the perfect echo is introduced in electrical engineering schools by studying what a phase conjugate dielectric is, which is to say a capacitor that has an insulator between the plates with a dielectric constant that's high enough means that when you ring that capacitor like a bell, it won't stop. Which is to say it is a 0-point energy implosive vacuum coherence device. Hint, hint. Lucifer's eye, Kaba stone, Philosopher's stone, projective powder, the red powder, Kelly and D. What we're learning here is that there is a seed for perfect implosive capacitance, perfect implosive resonance that can make charge converge to center so efficiently that it couples the vacuum, the very definition of 0-point energy device, which is why we need to study so very carefully what high dielectric materials are. You see, when you build a house and you want that house to allow your aura to grow, obviously if you put the steel and aluminum and electrosmog in your house, it's going to kill your aura and the souls of your children. Bad news. Steiner knew this very well. The children should only touch organic materials, living stone, living wood, living fabric, and the children should never touch metal or plastics, because your aura cannot inhabit them, and therefore you cannot become them. May the force be with you, Luke. So the only way you can build a house or a container in which living capacitance can propagate non-destructively is high dielectric materials. Hint, what we call organic materials, the good stuff for house building, is basically the fact that every molecule that wanted to join the fun club called life, he approached the club and knocked on the door, said, "Can I come in?" And they said, "Well, you need to rearrange your symmetry to be fractal. Get fractal or get dead." That's the bumper sticker on the side wall of the biologic architect. So the molecules that had the privilege of joining the fun club called life, which equals charge distribution efficiency, those molecules got rearranged into more fractal, like the clathrate geometry of living water, pent, ecosododeca, and the fact that every living protein, hint DNA, etc., apparently has pent symmetry. Why? Because they knew about get fractal or get dead a lot better than the architect who builds metal buildings, who should get fired. So if you have these high capacitive efficiencies, the high dielectric material, your aura can breathe because it's implosive, and therefore charge centripetal force, implosion, always precedes charge radiance, which is to say packing always precedes unpacking. Perfect packing is called implosion or phase conjugation. And now we're back to our picture of the phase conjugate mirror right here. So the wave path which allowed the opposing lasers to approach center non-destructively is called a phase conjugate mirror of super high dielectric barium strontium titanate, the miracle mystery material of phase conjugate optics. And that allows the optical geometries to converge like pine cones kissing noses. So the side view of that's a spiral, you see, becomes the Holy Grail cup. And we have that fabulous animation in 3D of that Holy Grail, which is simply a golden mean spiral in a cup within a cup, revolving infinitely. So four-wave mixing is a picture of a light cube. Now from that, we're going to learn, for that we already know from hard physics that you can create time reversal and negentropy. This is proven in phase conjugate optics. What we want to understand is how do we apply that to fusion and oneness experience, first in theater and psychologically, plasma fusion tantra, the physics of oneness, and then the physics of alchemy, and then the physics of cold fusion. So you see why it is about the cube of space, is that if you set up the array properly, you can create a centripetal force towards center. Now this is the critical ingredient of the origin of biologic negentropy. And first, we're going to do the theater part here, and then we're going to do more on the physics. But just the introduction to the physics here is to say that if you take this Planck length and time, the universal musical key signature of the quantum phone, every wave physics has ever measured divides evenly into Planck length and time. So it is the musical key signature of the universe. Now, if you multiply that by integer exponents of golden ratio, this was my discovery, this is the cover of my book, you produce the radii of hydrogen is what I discovered. You produce the frequency, the exact two frequencies of photosynthesis is what I discovered. You produce the harmonics of the Schumann resonance, that's what I discovered. You produce the harmonics of brainwaves. You produce all of biologic negentropy. You produce implosion because you produce a centripetal force. In fact, you produce the reason an object falls to the ground. Because when the waves converge and approach center, concentrically by golden spiral path, the phase velocities can add and multiply constructively, as well as the wavelengths. And when phase velocities add and multiply constructively as the charge approaches center, that turns the compression of charge towards center into the acceleration of charge towards center. And the name for that is called the gravity. In other words, now we know why an object falls to the ground, because golden ratio phase conjugation produces acceleration of charge towards center. And the proof of that is that the radii of hydrogen, and of course galaxies, etc., is all based on golden ratio, because that's how gravity is created. Implosive charge compression is gravity. So that's the new information that Hawking and Einstein failed to understand, because as Einstein himself said, if he knew what infinite charge compression was, how it worked, he would understand gravity. And of course, no one told him what a fractal was. And until me, no one knew what a fractal field is. We now know exactly what a fractal field is. A fractal field is the Planck length and time times integer exponents of golden ratio. Self-similarity optimized is fractality. Self-similarity optimized is the golden ratio, caduceus cascade. And that's what a pine cone kissing noses looks like. And it's well known that when you phase conjugate, you translate the transverse component of the electromagnetic, which is how most electromagnetic fields propagate. You translate that inertia, which is up and down, as it goes down that cone toward the center, this picture right here. As the wave goes down the cone, the spiral on the cone, and that's also related to the equation I wrote to place that golden spiral on the torus, which is animated to the origin of Hebrew and Sanskrit. We'll talk a minute about how the letters steer the torus donut also. So as that golden spiral goes down that cone towards center, the transverse electromagnetic is translated in vorticity. Now remember, when you study golden spiral in hydrodynamics class, they name it optimized translation of vorticity. But the new information is what's translated in vorticity between rotational inertia to linear inertia, literally mass, which is rotational. Mass is rotation of charge. That's what it is. So rotational inertia is translated non-destructively to linear inertia, which is, say, compressional inertia, which is called the longitudinal electromagnetic, sometimes incorrectly called scalar or torsional. So the longitudinal electromagnetic wave rarely understood except in phase conjugate optics and phase conjugate microwave, and of course, high-tech stuff. The longitudinal EMF component is faster than light, and if you interfere the longitudinal wave at a distance, you can create remote plasma containment, which is how the Russian woodpecker worked, the famous work by Tom Bearden, and the holy grail of plasma fusion, eliminating the need for atom smashers, because now we can do plasma containment by longitudinal microwave interferometry, and we have groups on that in Australia and Brazil and elsewhere. So it's clearly possible, and it's clear that we're wasting billions, enough to feed Africa, on these atom smashers to achieve fusion, because fusion is naturally occurring in longitudinal microwave interferometry if you understand how to reconverge the longitudinal component at a distance and the cross points at a distance, the remote plasma containment, then recreate the transverse component from the longitudinal component at a distance in the contained wave node of where the two longitudinal waves cross, and that is literally called the flame in the mind, and how you contain plasma heat at a distance, the holy grail of plasma fusion. And it's also exactly how Ingo Swann, using golden ratio in his brain waves, heated a thermistor at a distance with his mind through a Faraday cage. And this is called flameinmind.com, which is our new project in the iOS environment to develop biofeedback to teach the EEG brainwave component to do this, literally the physics of bliss. So where were we? We were back over here at Shakespearean theater. So here is John Dee. John Dee has written the hieroglyphic monad, which is literally his attempt to create the total oneness experience, the symbol system that creates oneness. The monad hieroglyphicus, literally the symbol of oneness. Later, we now realize what that is. That's the physics of the origin of alphabets, which teach waveforms how to converge and implode. So John Dee started the dream, but we must finish it. So John Dee was drawing this thing called the hypercube. And here are some of John Dee's earlier drawings, which then became the Shakespearean theater. Now, why would John Dee's hypercube geometries, first of all, become the Shakespearean theater? Well, Prospero, who was John Dee in Shakespeare's notes, understood that the physics of the fusion of plasma, which is the physics of communication with angelic forces, which are plasma bodies, had a language, and that language obviously is symmetry. So here is Darlene's analysis of the origin of the Ophanim Enochian letters, the alphabet of the angelic forces. The symmetry analysis of these letter forms comes in two stages. First, that when you look at the letter forms themselves, Darlene, with Vincent's help, concludes that each letter is a torn component off of a, which is say, an extracted component of a vortex on a donut. So if you take various viewpoints of a vortex on a donut, you get, and here's her analysis, you get basically all the Ophanim Enochian letters. These are basically ways to hook up wormholes and hook up vortex and string them together. It's string theory, vortex mechanics, turned into a symmetry alphabet. That's what the angelic was. So nesting vortex donuts, again, credit to Darlene and Vincent's work here in these drawings, is the symmetry physics root of the angel language. It makes sense. You know, the plasma universe physics people today are quite clear. The origin of the stories of angels are interstellar plasma beings. Well, how do they communicate? Well, they throw around pieces of their plasma bubbles, which are pieces of donuts. So when you throw around a piece of your plasma spin, you get the symmetry ingredients for angelic alphabets, which those Ophanim Enochian angelics went to so much trouble to try to teach Dee and Kelly. Now, the second part of this fun study of these vortex was, first of all, she's seeing that if you line up opposing pairs of these vortex and you line up opposing pairs of these letters, you create a magical space between them, which I am now going to call phase conjugate, for the reason that they become centripetal in that center point and they cast a spell. Now, how did I come to learn about casting spells? Well, with the help of Teresa Burns and Alan, when we did some of our early seminars with Vincent's help there in Torino, the very advanced O'Feynman-Enochian study group there in Torino had learned to very accurately focus their mind on these letter forms in a unique and spin-dense way. Think of this. We now know that the 7 arrows here, I have this animation I made when I put the equation, is it here? Yeah, here. If I don't know how fast this animation feeds in our bandwidth here, but you see, this is the 7 arrows, symmetry arrows through a tetrahedron, and I am simply advancing to the next point of view of the next of the 7 arrows through the tetra, and you see that I have the letters Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet, which is simply evidence of the fact that the Hebrew alphabet is the shadows of the charged donut torus domain, literally the Torah, indexed by the 7 arrows of the tetracube. So when you hold one Hebrew letter in your optical cortex with full focus, and the Hebrew rabbi who is making a golem fills the entire optical cortex with the shape of one letter, say the letter He, Yod He Vav He. Now, if you fill your optical cortex with the shape of the Hebrew letter He, and then just like the horse whisperer, who at a certain moment knows that she has formed the pictogram to send to the horse telepathy so effectively, then must stamp their foot and release the thought form. So you released your clear visual of that Hebrew letter He, which is a very particular tilt angle. It is a cubic tilt angle of the tetracube. And remember, your optical cortex is a charged donut. That's what it is. So you're blowing smoke rings. Not complicated. Any smoker knows that there's a certain symmetry to smoke ring blowing. So when you blow these smoke rings, if you do so in the right sequence, and this is what I learned in Torino, was that in the classical O'Feynman ritual, you have the 4 directions set up very accurately, and then in each of the 4 directions, an adept, someone who's very skilled at these visualization, literally blows the smoke ring of the certain sequence of letters, Ag, Da, Agla, Elohim, Aya, He. So you have these letters that are very accurately prescribed, and you focus on these letters in sequence, and then you blow these smoke rings towards center. And what we found was that the magnetic field, the charge field in that room was so strong that people got dizzy. It was powerful. Now, what we know is that properly done ritual, you know, the famous saying, blow your doors off. Well, the properly done ritual was powerful enough to change the air pressure in the church to blow the doors off. Well, actually, this is not surprising. The air pressure in the room would change. And the reason it would change was because you made a centripetal implosive charge field. Oh, I can move around great massive centers of air pressure. I can move around big vortex. I can move around tornadoes. I can move around big storms. This is giving us an introduction to what Dee and Kelly learned. Now, before we get to the story called the heptagonal workings of how Dee and Kelly made the storm that supposedly took out the Spanish Armada. Now remember, the meteorological history says that that storm that came from the North Sea had never happened before or since practically in history. So what brought that storm? Which apparently John Dee informed Queen Elizabeth a year ahead of time was going to happen. Okay, but first, the Tempest. Well, we need a little drama here. We're adding drama. We make it colorful. So here we have Vincent's analysis of the symmetry of the letters in the Tablet of Malvage, which is the Ophanim-Enochian letter geometry. And notice what it is. It's called a hypercube. Remember, not only did John Dee have the largest library in Europe in his day, he was the most advanced mathematician practically of his day. He spoke more languages than apparently most anyone else of his day. And he was famous for the mathematics of the hypercube. And he was famous for calling angels, which are sometimes called the macrobes, which we now know as interstellar plasma beings. And we're told that interstellar plasma beings regard us humans as drunk because we don't call them. The same way the elementals regard us as drunk because we don't work with them. Obviously, our tornadoes will go unsteered if we don't know how to steer them. So this business of controlling the direction of plasma storms is empowering, it's instructive, and it's essential. This sort of mythology, oh, this is evil or this is witchcraft, is childish, actually. We do not have the remotest chance of surviving the solar system if we don't learn how to steer plasma storms 101. This is basic. We got to give up on this idea that it's evil to be psychokinetic. In fact, the only thing that's evil is to not be psychokinetic, because then you're toast. So, once you understand that the geometric conditions which allow plasma storms to converge in charged space to complete the tetracube and then be embedded in the superposed spin symmetry axis, literally what it is to go to the next dimension. And this is what we mean here, is that if you take the 7 arrows of the tetracube and you tilt that cube right here, here you have 5 different colored cubes embedded in a dodecahedron. So if you complete the cube stably, then you can tilt that cube 32 degrees, the chin angle of the Sphinx, and then rotate, blink 5 times, and you have a pentadodeca, which is literally 5 spins outside, 7 spins inside, otherwise known as the Ophanim-Enochian sigil of truth. Here's the Ophanim-Enochian sigil of truth, which later we discovered is identical basically with the Cherokee and Bon Po. And so here's the 5 spins inside, the 7 spins outside, and we later know that this became the movie Stargate, and those letters became the movie Stargate, because that's how you get plasma to implode and make a Stargate. And we now know quite literally that our Therify device, in many respects, creates this kind of wormhole and creates a Stargate. We know what that is. It's not a mystery. And if you have extreme plasma aura coherence, you can be implosively projected through a Stargate and hold your attention together as you do that, which is called being a tron, which is basically having enough coherence in your aura to lucid dream. So practice lucid dreaming is critical for this ability to propagate yourself through this implosive wormholes. And also useful because that's how you will survive death. In fact, quite clearly, ability to lucid dream is a predictor of who will take memory through death, and we well understand the physics. So the new software, hrv-app.com, will have the breathing cues, and flameandmind.com, both iOS systems, will have the EEG cues to teach lucid dream switching, which starts with where you feel your physical body is frozen, and then you enter into the lucid dream wakefully. So what we call lucid dreaming skill is in fact the extreme aura coherence that allows you to direct the vector of the wavefront that went through the implosive conjugate into the longitudinal, which is the physics of entrance into the superluminal, and therefore entrance into time travel tron, and therefore entrance into the propagation mechanics of the collective unconscious, the communion of saints, and literally what it is to take memory through death, which is why you need a big or and a coherent or, and need to practice lucid dreaming. So, finishing just a little story then, King Rudolph had been brought up with King Philip of Spain, whose favorite occupation was to roast Protestants for breakfast. And so King Rudolph in Bohemia knew that King Philip of Spain building the Spanish Armada was a wacko, a nut job, and that Europe would be, let's say, Donald Trumped if King Philip were to win with the Spanish Armada approaching England. So he very much supported D. N. Kelly's agenda, which is called the heptagonal working. Now, we have the maps here, but I'm not going to bring them out at the moment. But there are 7 hills around Prague where the rabbis joined the ONEness team with D. N. Kelly, and they produced this plan to call a major plasma storm called the heptagonal workings, later featured in Shakespeare's play The Tempest, about Prospero, who was John Dee, fabricating this amazing storm, which has many echoes to Sorcerer's Apprentice and Mozart and many stories. And the Spanish sailors, blown away by this storm, even today, hundreds of years later, now live on the west coast of Ireland because of that storm. That's the mythology. And we'll investigate that mythology in the book. And the mythology is not the point here. The point here is the physics. And the physics is that if we don't learn to steer tornadoes, we appropriately are toast, because this is called biofeedback. And so steering tornadoes 101 is important science. And I recommend our web article with detail on this at www.goldenmean.info/dowsing. The short version of the story is that if you observe a shaman about to steer a tornado with a bit of clairvoyance, and incidentally, our Therify.net is very good at helping produce clairvoyance. But if you watch a shaman about to steer a tornado, you see what's called bioplasmic streamers emerging from the belly of the shaman into embedding non-destructively in the center of the tornado. Literally, the shaman's aura embeds itself in the plasma donut of the whole tornado. And the shaman calls that process eating the chucha of the tornado, which is quite literally eating the anger. Now, why do they call that eating the anger? Because the only pain you feel is the love you withhold. That's a quote from the Andromedans, if you believe it, Alex Collier. But what does that mean? It just means that the part of your body which feels pain is the part where compression of charge is broken because the fractality is broken. So when you restore fractal symmetry, the rose-like symmetry, you restore implosive charge compression, which is the opposite of pain, which is exactly how the Therify works. Therify.net, we don't make medical claims, but we find by numerous reports that we can eliminate localized pain, usually in 1 or 2 sessions. Really a very high percentage of experiencers report that. And in, say, 5 to 10 sessions, 5 minutes a day, we can, in many, if not most, many cases, eliminate long-term and chronic pain, which is amazing. So if you read all the reports, Therify.net, Therify.tech, Therify.fr, Therify.com.au, we're global. And you see that if you restore charge compression, you eliminate pain, which is to say, you eliminate where the plasma is bleeding charge, which is what pain is the bleeding of charge due to broken fractality. It's very parallel to Robert O. Becker's body electric, where he discovers that the crystal geometry at the axis to the wound, which is bleeding voltage, and if you increase that voltage, which is, say, the pressure, you restore the healing because you restore centripetal electrical force. Also relates to why it's so well medically documented that negative ions create healing because they're implosive, fractal, and centripetal, little black holes. So, restored centripetal forces, implosion, which is really introduction to alchemy and phase conjugates, is what this lecture is all about. And we're finishing up now the section on John Dee and alchemy, but before we move on to defending the hypothesis that this is the origin of all negentropic forces, I want to finish up the section about John Dee and Kelly, which I call Shakespearean fusion, with just a couple more thoughts. One is that the dimensions of the structure, the dimensions of the architecture, rely on something called sacred dimension. And that we now know what the ratio has to be. Everybody knows the ratio has to be related to golden ratio and implosive phase conjugate global scaling, scale invariance, so-called. But what about the scaling? Well, the scaling, you know, in my equation, we're about to discuss all the examples from my equation, is all based on Planck length and time. So what does this say about sacred dimension, sacred architecture, and sacred units of length? And we will use the example of my good friend, recently deceased John Michel, in his book, City of Revelation, in View over Atlantis. Now, John Michel spent a good part of his life in which he wasn't drinking and smoking. I love the guy, wonderful. But, you know, he was very British, and therefore, well, we're going to criticize all cultures equally tonight, so it's okay. But John Michel spent a good part of his life trying to prove that the British unit of measure was sacred and the metric unit of measure was horrible, profane, a sin, sacrilegious, etc., etc. After John Michel's death, I believe I have proven why he was right. And here is my proof. So this in front of us here is John Michel's key table, in which he says this unit of length, the DC here, this distance from here to here, which is the Raman. It's one of the most sacred units of length, very ancient, the Raman. And that if you multiply by square root of 2, you get the royal cubit. Square root of 3, you get the Palestinian cubit. Square root of 4 times 2, you get the Roman pace. And if you multiply by the square root of 5, you get the megalithic yard. And if you multiply by the square root of 6, you get the English yard, the British yard. So suddenly the foot, the Raman, the cubit, the yard, the Roman pace, they all fit together in one simple geometric cascade, all based on the foot and the yard. So this was John Michel saying, oh, everything fits here except the meter, it don't fit. Now later, after John Michel died, I discovered that if you take the Planck length times exactly golden ratio to an integer multiple, a whole number multiple of golden ratio to the 164 power, you get exactly 0.9964 British feet, a foot. So the British foot, which is the basis of all of this, is precisely phase conjugate charge collapse to Planck. And what is the meter? The meter is crap. What this means is that structures based upon sacred phase conjugate dimensioning to Planck, the foot, the meter, the yard, so the foot, the yard, the pace, etc. They're set up so the wave functions can conjugate all the way down by golden ratio to the Planck dimension and implode there and distribute their charge infinitely into the media called the Planck radio, which is the collective unconscious. Whereas the meter, unfortunately, doesn't fit this, what's called perfect embeddability, and is therefore not sacred. So this, in my view, is the definition of global scaling, is Planck times integer multiples golden ratio. And it is the title and the cover of my new book, which we're about to discuss. So you see how that this dimensioning issue now is solved once you understand that it's the ratio down to the distribution of Planck that allows implosive phase conjugate charge collapse, and therefore charge distribution efficiency, the definition of life. Get fractal or get dead. So this is the same golden ratio you see if you plot the Mandelbrot fractal and you plot the division points here. It's golden ratio to the third, golden ratio to the sixth power. So here I've overlaid the golden ratio on the Mandelbrot fractal and get the same principle of a pine cone kissing noses here, right here in the Mandelbrot fractal. It's so cool. Okay, so we talked about the hypercube and John Dee. Now, the last thing we want to talk about is the psychological aspect of this. Why was this the design? Why is the hypercube the solution to theater and the solution to oneness experience? For this, I need another sip of tea. One moment here. My weakness is my throat. I have to be gentle here. Okay. So, in this section, we want to examine why and how it is that the possibility of plasma fusion is identical with the possibility of human oneness experience. Whether you're talking about theater, whether you're talking about tantra, the physics is the same, is that there's only one geometry which allows the little donut of charge to non-destructively embed in the bigger donut of charge without loss of spin inertia. And non-destructive embedding of the little field effect into the big field effect, the true physics of alchemy, charge implosion, is how your aura inhabits the collective aura, and both of your memories survive. It's how your aura inhabits your lover's aura, and your memories survive. It's how your aura inhabits the aura, the plasma domain of the theater and experiences a collective mind experience. Because obviously producing the collective mind, producing the oneness experience is the physics of alchemy, the subject of Shakespeare, and the true spiritual meaning. That's the point here. So how is this enabled by the fact that the hypercube design became Shakespearean theater design? So here are John Dee's diagrams of the overview plan. So here he's put the cube, the perfect cube in the perfect sphere, which we now know is the perfect stellation of the cube, which eventually embeds in the dodeca. But in this case, it's simply a stellated cube, which Vincent said the stellated cube was the hypercube. I say when the hypercube embeds in the dodeca, that is the door of the next dimension, but that's the next step. So at any rate, the hypercube of John Dee, this whole book is saying, is the origin of Shakespearean theater. Now, if you look at Shakespearean theater, here it is. That is a shadow of a cuboctahedron right there, and that's Shakespearean theater. And here is the cubic view from within. Now, how is that enabling the possibility of oneness experience? And this will be worked out in much more detail in the book in care of Teresa Burns. But in summary, if you look at A Midsummer Night's Dream, for example, you see one group of people experiencing opposite emotions. First, they experience fear, and then they anger, and then love, and then hate. And so you have these pairs of opposing emotions. Now, if you ever really became aware of how it is that you know you fully love another person, is you've seen opposing emotions converge into oneness. Now, there's more to this, because if we understand the physics of emotion properly, and this is the real issue here, it's called the geometry of touch. And if you look at the physics of emotion in the Sentics literature by Manfred Clynes, you see that if you analyze the way people express emotion in touch, and he found this by finding out how you touch a violin string with a sequence of emotions to make your audience cry. And he found that by analyzing the change of pressure over time of the touch, you could distinguish joy from anger, from hate, from love. So opposing emotions have very specific opposing wave mechanics. And we now know that, that the wave shape that is anger, for example, reaches a point of max. These are the wave shapes here, remember, is Manfred Klein's work, but the geometric analysis of the wave shapes is my work. And what I determined is that if you set the beginning of the emotion of touch to the end versus the moment when that touch reaches a moment of maximum pressure, you establish a simple set of ratios which are geometrically incredibly elegant. And I give the example that the change in pressure of over time of the pressure of the wave of touch that is called love, whether that is the way in which you squeeze your lover to say, I love you. It's been identified and measured in thousands of experiments. And in fact, the change of pressure over time in the touch that says, I love you is very specific. And what happens is the moment of maximum pressure in the duration of that love hug is reached at exactly 0.618 golden ratio into the duration of that event of touch, which sets up a heterodyne cascade, which looks like a donut in a donut. It looks like, I had a lovely picture. It looks like the Valentine of a heart within hearts. This is all at goldenmean.info/touch. But basically, I thought I had a nice little picture in here. I lost one picture. Oh well. But if you take that great old picture of a spiral within a spiral, it literally a Valentine, when you do the wave shape that is the love hug, that pressure, you set up that cascade of pressures toward an implosive center point, which is the Valentine you send your lover because you sent implosion. Now, a profound example of that, in my view, would be the perfect birth canal. That if you if you study the physics of the rebirthing literature, what the perfect birth is the perfect squeeze, which is the perfect phase conjugate implosive collapse of the birth canal that creates the moment of maximum pressure where an infinite number, and I say infinite number of waves can converge at once. Which is how you bring interstellar memory through birth, which is why you desperately need a birth canal, which is why Caesar, who had the cesarean section, could not do Joseph Tilton Peirce's bond of power and therefore could not bond with his mother, his family, his land, the Druids. He couldn't feel outside as if it was inside. He had failure to bond. So Caesar was a murderer because of the cesarean section, because he didn't get a birth canal. Which means that the place of the infinite perfect sorting of memory of the perfect birth did not happen. And this was failure to bond. And I mean literally electromagnetically produce the possibility of electrical bonding, which is then the beginning of all forms of compassion and turning inside outness and feeling the outside as if it were the inside, which is to feel your land as if it is your body. So, of course, you will destroy your environment if you don't get the proper birth. This is fundamental to sustainable ecology science, is the physics of birth. So what profound rebirthing does, John Diamond, placental extract, belly of the surrogate mother, deep breathing, underwater, maximum point of charge compression, and you re-enable the sorting experience of the implosive pressures of the perfect birth canal, where all waves are touched and sorted at once, where then memory is sorted, and therefore then you can bond. So this is Introduction to the Physics of Birthing, Introduction to the Physics of Emotion. This is the Psychophysics of Emotion, which is simply an index to a simple sequence of ratios in touch. Now, we're back to the Shakespearean theater. So if you get these opposing emotions sending their wave shapes towards center, and I'm using Midsummer Night's Dream here, and this will be analyzed in much more detail in the book, but basically, the actors at first they experience, anger, and then they experience hate, and then they experience joy, and then they experience love. And these are set up in opposing opposite pairs inside a cube. Shakespearean theater. Now, what happens first is the audience is looking from the consumed perspective of the faces of the tetracube. And they see, oh, well, there's this group of people, and they're dumb because they're doing anger. And then these are, well, these are strange, they're doing joy. And these are strange. But then suddenly when you realize there's a certain moment at the end of the play when you realize, oh, they've experienced all the emotions together, and each of the actors has done the archetype of the full spectrum called harmonic inclusiveness. And so suddenly the audience identifies with the whole instead of the parts. So there's a centripetal moment, literally electrically centripetal plasma fusion moment at the climax of the play in which the audience suddenly feels for everyone at once. They inhabit the larger plasma body of the whole instead of the separated parts. And that's enabled by the phase conjugate tetracubic symmetry of the hypercube plasma theater that John Dee designed for Shakespeare. Literally, oneness experience is enabled by a profound series of tetracubic symmetry operations, phase conjugate four-wave mixing in the theater to enable the experience of oneness, which is actually how we gather our collective auras to enable us to project ourselves back into the stars, carry Mother's nature's silver seed to a new home in the sun. Lucid dreamers practice by finding out if they can lucid dream together. And this is the physics of the plasma physics of instructions on how to do that. So that will be developed in much greater detail in the books that are coming on Alchemy of Plasma Fusion in Shakespearean Theater with myself and Teresa Burns. So the next section of this conversation is to just review the evidence for a phase conjugate model of the origin of all biologic negentropy, which is literally my book. So for this, I'm going to be using some of the images from my book, fractalfield.com. And this particular section is fractalfield.com/conjugate perception, in which I'm in particular trying to prove that phase conjugation is the cause of perception, peak perception, and bliss. But we're going to use this as in a more generalized sense also to defend the hypothesis, which is central to my book, that phase conjugation is the origin of all biologic negentropy. So yes, here's the summary. So I say that the compelling formula for fractal physics here is that exact integer exponents, multiples of golden ratio, phase conjugation, multiples of Planck length and time, produce exactly the generalized wave geometric cause of gravity, life force, and biologic negentropy. Literally, why objects fall to the ground. This is how wave geometry creates negentropy, so well proven in phase conjugate optics. Golden ratio phase conjugation is the only wave geometry which defines a fractal field. So these virtually exact integer exponents of golden ratio, phase conjugate, multiples of Planck length and time predict exact radii of hydrogen, 3 exact radii of hydrogen. They predict the exact only 2 frequencies which produce photosynthesis, phase conjugate, negentropic collapse. They produce virtually exactly the harmonic series called the Schumann resonance harmonics. They predict virtually exactly the alpha beta frequency cascade of the harmonics of brain waves that cause bliss and peak perception. This equation predicts virtually exactly the duration of the Earth year and the Venus year. The equation predicts virtually exactly the frequencies Priori and Rauscher used to heal, which I then translated to be phase conjugate magnetics and became my Therify.net. This becomes this frequency series becomes the imploder.com and purify.com and therify.net successful commercial bioactive systems. Further, then, I showed that if you take this frequency series, again, Planck length and time times golden ratio, integer exponents, you get the 0.1 hertz Mayer wave, which is the natural resonance frequency of the blood pressure of the body, which is also, you get the LF and HF exact frequency centers of the major harmonics of heart rate variability. So you have the spine liquid pump and the heart rate variability, the HRV, become phase conjugate negentropic collapse. And that, show another picture of that in a moment, but here is the picture of the 3 radii of hydrogen, Planck times golden ratio 116, 17, and 18 power, and you get exactly the 3 radii, major radii of hydrogen, which I say is strong evidence that this is how gravity is caused. Now, here is the picture here of the 2 frequencies that make photosynthesis possible. You have 427 nanometer and 691 nanometer, the purple and orange light, which only make photosynthesis. Green light is poison to photosynthesis. That's why every plant is green, because it spits that out, because that is a cubic tilt of the photon donut called light. That if you take the extended visible spectrum from red to ultra red, 700 to 350 nanometers, and you plot that 180-degree tilt of the photon that is a torus, that exactly halfway from 0 to 180 degrees there, the 90-degree distance is exactly green, which is the 90-degree phase angle of the photon torus. We can prove that color is the 3-dimensional tilt of the photon as a torus. First of all, it's ridiculous to say that color is simply a wavelength when we know that the photon is a donut. The photon is not flat, it's not 2-dimensional. Hello, no, the photon is 3D, and all wave packets travel toroidally. We know that. And further, we know that since color is only perceived in the cone of the eye, and then in electromagnetics, you can only use a cone for one thing as an antenna, which is to measure the tilt or the phase angle of the incoming field donut. Therefore, the cone of the eye, where color is perceived, is by definition a device to measure tilt or phase angle of incoming photon donuts. So color is the tilt or phase angle of the photon of the donut. That is, in my view, self-evident. Now further, if the visible spectrum, 180 degrees of that tilt from red to ultra red here, is that if you take that distance from 0 to 180 degrees, here's a bigger version of the same picture, that 45 degrees along that path, you have exactly orange, and 90 degrees, you have green. Remember, 90 degrees is opposite to phase conjugate. So green is called negative green because it's poison to photosynthesis and effectively poison to life, because for the same reason that a 90-degree angle is evil in astrology and feng shui, because it's optimized destructive wave interference. An octave is a way to optimize destructive wave interference, and that, which is to say, the opposite of charge distribution efficiency, therefore the opposite of life. There's a famous story about negative green in psychotronics, which explains. So now you know exactly why green prevents photosynthesis. So the only angles of the tilt of the donut, so 135 degrees is purple, but the only angles of the tilt of the photon donut, right on this scale, which are not cubic angles, 45, 90, 135, 180, are blue and yellow. Ta-da! And the angle of tilt here, if you're simply on the continuous scale, which produce blue and yellow, is 63 and 117 degrees. And it turns out that 63 and 117 degrees, if I take this angle here, this dodecahedron here, the angle that this dodecahedron makes to the floor here that angle right there. See that angle? There's an angle. Okay, that's 117 degrees from here to here and 63 degrees from here to here. So yellow and blue are the angle that tilts the photon donut into the pentadodecahedron, which is to say phase conjugate charge implosion. Therefore, I say is strong proof, this was my discovery, that phase conjugation by pent-dodeca angles is the cause of the existence of color. So if you understand that rainbows exist because photons phase conjugate, then you can understand why rainbows occur only when the air is charged. You can understand why you only see the green flash at the sunset on the seacoast when the air is phase coherent. You only see rainbows when a Tibetan saint dies because he's added centripetal charge to his environment, which is what you do when you die if you're good. Well documented that the death of Tibetan saints caused rainbows. Now we know the physics. So we're just introducing this idea then that phase conjugation is the origin of biologic negentropy, and one example of that negentropy is the existence of the possibility of color. So now we know why color exists, and we know why objects fall to the ground. Actually, maybe we should take that picture one step further, just to state the obvious here, that if you look at that path to center, let's see, I have the picture in the hydrogen picture here, just to see the cause of gravity in this story. Yeah, here it is. That each time these waves add and multiply when they cross here at the golden ratio node points of the infinite pentacle, what's happening is the wave velocity is adding and multiplying constructively, which only the golden ratio permits. And when the wave velocities add and multiply constructively, that turns compression of charge into acceleration of charge towards center. And as we discussed, that's called gravity. Gravity is indistinguishable from acceleration of charge. So therefore, we now know why an object falls to the ground, something that Stephen Hawking and Einstein did not know. Because now we know that phase conjugation causes gravity. Now we know that that the masses of the universe, for example, are well documented to be arranged dodecahedrally. That's the cover of New Scientist magazine. And therefore, that makes more gravity. So suddenly you know that when you arrange masses dodecahedrally by golden ratio, you make more gravity than when they're not by golden ratio. So suddenly there's no longer a need to invent this stupid idea of dark matter, because dark matter is only physics' way of saying we don't know why there's more gravity in some places than others. That's the only reason the hypothesis of dark matter exists. And once you know how to make more gravity in some places than others by arranging masses dodecahedrally, as in fact the masses in the universe are arranged, suddenly the need for explaining extra gravity goes away, because you now know where the extra gravity came from. Proof of that will be when you arrange masses in dodecahedron stellations based on golden ratio to Planck and see that there's a slight increase in gravity. A very simple experiment will prove that this theory of gravity improves on Einstein. So this is a basic outline of why I believe, of the evidence I believe that when you arrange harmonics in golden ratio to Planck, you produce the origin of all negentropy. Here are some of the other charts in the book at fractalfield.com, origin of negentropy, showing that the frequencies heard by meditators in Kundalini and bliss fit that cascade here. And in the sacrocranial literature, we talked about HRF, the HF and LF. And this is the braid algorithm in DNA, 5 spins and 7 spins. That 5 spins is in the thread that is the dodeca ratchet, that is DNA, because the cube is 3 spin space. If you tilt the cube into dodeca, you have 4x of spin, which is why I say the dodeca is in fact a hypercube. But then if you ratchet the dodeca down a helix, which is what DNA thread is, you have 5 axes of spin symmetry, 5 spins inside. But then if you take that thread and you braid the braid of the braid of the braid on the braid, thread to string to rope to fat rope, and DNA eventually becomes toroidal, and you have the microchloridians in the blood and the boson 7, and the DNA turns inside. So you have 7 spins outside and 5 spins inside. That's how you get a soul. Your DNA implodes. You bend the light, becomes psychokinetic. Your DNA becomes superconductive. And you have the force be with you. So this is just an introduction to my book, Origin of Biologic Negentropy, which says that this fundamental phenomena of fractal relationship by golden ratio phase conjugation of Planck length and time produces all the primary wavelengths that produce negentropy. The final examples I will use here. Here's the HF and LF wave. Here is the frequencies in red that my equation predicts in the 0.1 hertz area, including the Mayer wave right here. And here are the frequencies in green of the tidal frequency of the sacrocranial literature. So the very known low frequencies of the spine liquid pump suddenly become understandable as my equation predicts their precisely phase conjugate negentropic collapse. You know that those low frequencies present in the spine makes depression literally impossible. And when your spine liquid is pumping by this equation series, you have the physics of bliss and kundalini. And here I've also shown that the wavelength here, 1.9 angstroms, 1.93 1.936 angstroms, which is the wavelength of ADP ATP. The adenosine triphosphate of all cellular metabolism is actually precisely a phase conjugate collapse wave to Planck. So ADP ATP is actually a phase conjugate collapse wave implosive phenomenon too. And remember, the Dratch showed you measure that distance in the microwave radiance from the spine, and you can measure kundalini in the microwave from the spine radiance, the microwave scanning emissions technology from Dratch. So these are many more examples. And just finally, these are the harmonics, 2.78, 4.5, 7.29, 11.8. The harmonic series that my equation predicts in the low frequency range, and this is the actual harmonics of the Schumann resonance series here in green, which fit almost exactly my equation for phase conjugate collapse. So we know why Gaia is self-organizing, self-regulating, because the Schumann harmonic series is phase conjugate negentropic charge collapse. And we can fix the Schumann harmonics to restore negentropy to the Earth. That's a profound statement. You can actually go to the wave nodes and fix the Schumann harmonics to more correctly make them implode, and Earth will become more negentropic, and we could emerge from chaos if we knew the only path out of chaos, which is the origin of biologic negentropy, which is this equation on the cover of my book. Further, then if you draw those wave points of the Schumann harmonics, phase conjugate harmonics, they become exactly the alpha beta harmonics delta, which precisely identify what the brain waves have to do to produce peak perception. And bliss, literally the flame in the mind, phase conjugate wave, which is originally my bliss tuner and will now be flameinmind.com as we implement the emotive Bluetooth headset onto the iPhone iOS system, flameinmind.com. So all of this is about this phase conjugate collapse, which we animated here. So I say this is strong evidence that we can restore centripetal forces once we understand the only possible path out of chaos. And finally, as we, in the evening's conversation, just to say that we have now proven that this form of negentropy works commercially by implementing it in plasma called Therify.net. We're producing time reversal, we're producing negentropy, we're producing rejuvenation. Many people don't need their glasses anymore. Many people have lost their long-term pain. We're not making medical claims, but the reports are becoming quite dramatic. Recently, the report of white blood cell count, we were able to help someone with leukemia, it appears, but we're waiting until this is documented medically, but the preliminary evidence is strong. And we can deal with short-term pain very quickly, usually, and long-term pain in many cases. And we've helped many situations, including cancers, as Priori did. Remember, Priori's plasma system, described at Therify.net, was the most successful cancer treatment probably ever tested on the planet. Hundreds, if not thousands, of documented cases of cancer solution. And what Priory did was he produced this frequency cascade into plasma. And I realized later the reason Priory couldn't pursue it was no one understood the physics. But when I analyzed with the Priory system, I found these were the frequencies Priory used: 3 hertz, 10 hertz, 32 hertz, and 80 hertz. I immediately recognized my equation. These are the harmonics in my equation: Planck length times Golden ratio, integer exponents: 2.78 hertz, 11.8, 30.88, and 80.85. So Priory has 1, 2, 3, 4, even 5 harmonics bang on my equation in the low frequency component of what he put in the plasma. So I immediately recognized how to fix and complete what he tried to do by completing that harmonic cascade. So I feed these low frequencies accurately modulated, and then I modulate them onto a high frequency megahertz range, which is intellectually proprietary, into a phase conjugate array and modulate that through a bifilar Tesla coil, also proprietary, thanks to Paul Harris, my partner, Therify.net, and produce about 500,000 volts, driving this plasma to do this: make this caduceus to phase conjugate to this Planck dimension right in the plasma. And here's a picture of what the wave function does between the plasma tubes. We apologize if the Medical Association did not know what their logo was for. I took a picture of a caduceus here and made a picture of what's happening to the field effects between the plasma tubes, with this being the Planck dimension right here in red. So as Paul so well noted when we devised the logo for the Therify system, which is, here's the logo, that the ancients apparently had a plasma tube, and we actually see a worm going down the center of our plasma tubes in a spiral like this, right from the Egyptian model. So we say, this is not von Däniken saying the Egyptians knew how to make light bulbs. Nope. We say, this is the Egyptians knowing how to make plasma into rejuvenation fields called "I will raise a Shem unto the Lord." That actually this was their age reversing system. We know from Sitchin and those who have done perhaps maybe better homework on the Anunnaki, Sumerian, Draco languages, and that's sort of another story in our work with Anton Parks. But basically their major issue when they arrived here was catastrophic premature aging. So they said, "I will raise a Shem unto the Lord," which became our word chem, as in chemistry, and alchemy, which we now know means access to a black hole. Now, the word Shem in the Bible was translated to mean the altar in the church, but we now know what that is that is a black hole making electric field. That's what a real altar in a real church has to be, which is what the Ark of the Covenant was. So that when they said, "I will raise a Shem unto the Lord," they meant, I will make a bioactive field to prevent aging called the Garden of Eden. And preventing aging was their catastrophic issue. So making the rejuvenation field was the science of Thoth Hermes, whose symbol was the caduceus, which today is called phase conjugation. Do you see how it all fits together so beautifully? So the logo of the Egyptians is the logo of the Therify, because we're doing what they did. If you look in our plasma tubes, they look like this picture. So here's what some of the plasma systems of the Therify look like. That's the 500,000 volts going into the plasma. And the noble gas mixture is a phase conjugator. The particular noble gas mixture is part of the intellectual proprietary content. Here's what the Therify case looks like. That contains this is the amplifier section. This is the 500,000 volt bifilar Tesla coil. And this is what the plasma tubes looks like. See if there's some better pictures. There we go. So we're delivering a complex wave array into a broad spectral amplifier from the ELF all the way to the megahertz range. And by accurately modulating the low frequencies on the high frequency, complete harmonic cascade, and then 2 opposing pairs, precise 180-degree opposite phase conjugate into bifilar Tesla, so you get the complete phase discipline amplified all the way up to 500,000 volts, and from there it's delivered to these plasma tubes here. And it's a center point between these tubes. You can actually feel your finger getting colder. And you can actually feel the tip of these tubes spontaneously get colder. Remember that Schauberger said, when the vortex spontaneously gets colder, that's when you know you're going to begin creating electricity from gravity. So spontaneously colder is a measurement of implosion because it means heat is being eliminated, which means disorder is being eliminated. A very defining element of onset of negentropy is the fact of spontaneous cooling, which we do experience here. So this is the Therify system turned off, and here you see the Therify system turned on. We use the plasma tube pairs. Here we were able to dramatically help this person in Belgium who had an implant in his foot, an extreme pain, could barely walk, and within one series of successions he could walk and his pain was gone. It was amazing. But here in the laying down position on the table, it's very wonderful to have very relaxing, euphoric bliss kinds of experiences, and many, many people have bliss and euphoria experiences here, and also clairvoyance experiences. So, and the spacing between the tubes can be adjusted depending whether you're focusing in on a primary. This guy here had some serious problems with his knees. Actually, he's a doctor. And we were able to help. And here's Roger Green, one of our great sponsors for Therify in New York and Prague. And we work with Roger all over the world. And just demonstrating that you adjust the spacing between these tubes depending on where you want to focus. This person had a problem with circulation in his hand. And we're very good at adding to circulation because remember, restored charge distribution efficiently defines circulation efficiency and therefore blood circulation efficiency. So people who have numbing and other problems and need help restoring circulation, we're very often able to help these people. This is just a little bit about the history here. This is the Lakowski device, which we now know is based on golden ratio. And Lakowski is one of these people that kind of like walks out of Tesla's experience, where hundreds of people came into Tesla's lab to be healed because the blue sparks were so healing. And later they studied these high voltage blue sparks, and Lakowski figured out golden ratio capacitance, golden ratio harmonic series in the Lakowski coil was naturally healing. Now, we take what Lakowski did and make it more broad spectral because we add the optical with the plasma. So the point is that the more broad spectral, harmonic inclusive, the phase conjugation, the more powerfully negentropic. And many very experienced persons with Lakowski systems here in France report that the Therify system is like Lakowski, but orders of magnitude more powerful and faster. So it fits that simply by adding the optical component to what Lakowski did, we produce a much more powerful, similar to what Priori did, but now we've optimized. And Priori needed a whole house full of electromagnetics gear to produce this plasma. We can do it in a box because of the advancement since Priori's time in solid-state electronics. So just to say that our ability to make a device that does this, and that the success of Therify.net, and read about our results all over the world, that process is evolving rapidly, is proof that the theory produces a technology which is successful, which is strong evidence that the theory is correct, that we know how to produce negentropy with the equation on the cover of my book, and the success of the Therify project is strong evidence that my book is correct, that I have discovered the origin of biologic negentropy. Really, Hermes did, but you know, we're walking in his footsteps. This is a Hermetic revolution. And finally, just to say that the theory of cancer on which this is based can be drawn in one simple picture, that that the wavelengths that enter the cell as food are relatively longer wave. And then the cell metabolism massages the wavelength of the proteins, the food, into shorter waves, one stage of which is called DNA precursor. This is a theory of the biophysics of cellular metabolism based upon my teacher, Earl Etienne, at University of Worcester, Massachusetts, biophysics. And finally, at the climax of cell metabolism, the final driver of cell metabolism is high quality coherent ultraviolet light, UV, the blue fire sex juice of the cell. Now, when the cell climaxes cell metabolism with the high quality UV light, it must either distribute that UV coherence, it's literally its creative juices, or if not, it will be driven into premature cell division, because cell division is a way of taking the high quality ultraviolet light and doing something with it, which is just exactly like young teenagers. If you teach them art and music and dance and sports, then they don't have children prematurely. But if they have no way out for their creative juices, then they're promiscuous, and the cell is the same way. And the proof of that is the fact that the cell membrane, when it becomes too hard or too spherical, cannot distribute the ultraviolet. And when contact does not inhibit replication, that is the only definition of cancer, contact inhibition, which is to say the cell is no longer able to propagate its ultraviolet through the cell membrane. It's too hard. So surfactants like lecithin, for example, are helpful for cancer because they allow charge distribution of the ultraviolet through the membrane. Well, what the phase conjugate field of the Therify does, or at least clearly the phase conjugate field of Prairie did, hundreds of cases of cancer cured, documented by the French government, is it provided a path out for the UV through the phase conjugate center. So suddenly you got this high frequency distribution enabled by a phase conjugate field. Obviously, charge distribution efficiency is the opposite electrically of cancer by definition, because cancer is a cell getting asocial, basically. It no longer responds to touch. It no longer distributes its creative juices. It's high quality UV light. It's sex juice. So you see this enabled charge distribution of phase conjugate field is in fact the opposite of cancer. So it makes total sense that Prairie discovered that. Now we feel we're well on the track with Therify.net. And incidentally, just in closing, we think this will also be the ultimate trigger for stem cell dedifferentiation. It's also the ultimate treatment for water. Bovis scales and other measures of water zapped with Therify is off the charts, and also Therify is able to charge rock powders for incredible growth effect and water healing effect. Piezoelectric rock powders zapped in this way, like Plucker.de, but better with Therify. And we now know that seed treatment, like what Stonehenge was for, is enabled by such phase conjugate device. And this will, we think, be the ultimate seed treatment device. So there's all kinds of implications. Shamanic wormholes, remote viewing, which well documented, produces clairvoyance. It's very good at enabling the release of ghosts. So there's lots of implications here. In fact, it is the beginning of a Stargate technology, quite literally. So thank you very much. Thanks for listening. Maybe I should check for questions here.
So if anyone has any questions, go ahead and type them up in the Q&A section. We don't have any as of yet.
So we appreciate your interest. The information is at fractalfield.com, therify.net, goldenmean.info. The book is available there as a PDF online. The book is available as a printed book, and it's available as a Kindle. So thank you for your interest. If you're interested in participating in our research projects, send me a note, info@fractalfield.com. Note, we're particularly interested in working with people who have technical and laboratory access and skills. So thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Neil. Appreciate working with you.
We have one question, Dan. Can you explain?
Oh, yeah. Can you explain a little much what was Stonehenge was for?
Yes.
Well, you know, that is the book Seeds of Knowledge by Burke and Levengood. Burke and Levengood started out by showing, we have a slide of that here, but started out by showing that seeds exposed to Stonehenge light structures grew dramatically better. And I mean, you know, 20 to 40% increase in growth by simply zapping the seeds present for a while in a Stonehenge-like structure. But now later, Levengood and Burke developed high voltage pulse treatments to achieve the same thing in seeds. Unfortunately, Burke and Levengood died before that work was completed. Our friend Nancy Talbot was trying to support that work. But now we realize that the high frequency pulse that delivered seed growth, which is really the, you know, archaeologists studied ancient stone dolmen in North America, and they say, oh, well, the stone quoit, the stone dolmen, the stone cave were not made to live in, they were not made to store food, they were not made for, no, they were made to zap the seeds, and they were made to zap the shaman, because the shaman could actually produce lucid dreaming, remote viewing, successful death and birth, etc., in the stone structures, and you could produce seed growth. So they were a survival device for a civilization whose agriculture was on the point of starvation, that if you used the proper seed treatment from the pulse field of the phase conjugate implosive centripetal field of the stone dolmen array. And the proof of that is in the spectrum analysis of the capacitance of those arrays. And you can read about that at goldenmean.info/biophoton. So in short, these stone circles work to produce a bioactive field. And much more about that at bioactivefield.com. Is there effect on telomere length? Well, telomere is like the cap on the end of a shoestring. Okay, so the coherent phonon geometry we proved that the coherent low frequency sound of the heart measurably affects DNA braid. That was the study done by Glenn Ryan of the effect of coherent heart on DNA braiding. Remember, I invented the concept of heart coherence because I invented how to measure it, and HeartMath kind of screwed that up. But we've all that, if you read in the section at hrv-app.com on how we measure coherence, you get the history of heart coherence. Also at fractalfield.com/coherence. So the low frequency phonon triggers a DNA braid. If the DNA braiding is in phase with long wave phase conjugation, the physics of bliss and superconductivity in DNA, and that is what keeps this telomere geometries stable, because consistent access to coherent emotion, which is literally consistent access to bliss, is the immortality device, because it stabilizes the DNA braiding, which is what keeps the telomeres in place. You can contact me, info@therify.net for Therify questions, or info@fractalfield.com. What is the name of the iOS app for EEG? It's flameinmind.com. The EEG part of that, flameinmind.com, is months away. However, the EKG, heart rate variability part, is beautiful, gorgeous, fabulous, and that is coming through the App Store any day, hrv-app.com, or iThrive, ITHRVE.com, and you'll see the dramatic relationship we've established between breath training, coherence training, sacrocranial measure. We actually measure blood oxygen with a finger clip, and we do overnight HRV analysis. It's a Cadillac ultimate of heart biofeedback, and it's all on the iOS, and it's amazing. hrv-app.com is fabulous, and which is coming out any day, and all the descriptions are there at hrv-app.com and ithrive.com. And then the EEG component of that, the Brainwave Bliss Tuner, which is a headless Bluetooth EEG headset, gorgeous stuff from Emotive, flameinmind.com. That will be some months down the road, but it will operate as an extension too, right in the context of all the data you're getting from your heart. So the heart-brain connection is all there. Are there geometrical images of different emotions? If so, where can I find them? goldenmean.info/touch is the article about the pure geometric ratio in the language of touch. Basically, you learn to withhold the moment of maximum pressure in the touch that says love, because the moment of maximum pressure is tangibly delayed. It's very simple. If you're squeezing someone's hand to say joy, the point of max pressure is reached 1/6 in the duration of that squeeze. If you're squeezing someone to say I love you, it's much different. The moment of maximum pressure in the squeeze hug that says love is tantrically delayed until 0.618 into the duration of that squeezing process, which sets up a phase conjugate implosive caduceus array in the pressure waves towards center. It looks like a Valentine, and that's the rush, the tingle you feel. That's why if you've applied an academically precise love hug, the test question for afterwards is, did you feel a tingle in your DNA? Okay, is that good for the questions?
Yeah, that's it. Thank you so much, brother.
Blessings, blessings. So I look forward to receiving the recording.
Yes, sir. I'll send that to you within a couple of days.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Have a beautiful night.
Blessings. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
All right. That was truly amazing. And just remember, everyone, that we're going to be giving the recording. So Dan has a lot of information, so you can